All right, everybody, welcome back. It's the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And today we are discussing climate change indie rock albums of 2024 and 2025, particularly those by Mount Eerie and Dirty Projectors, David Longstreth, Stargaze, the three-way collaboration that has just dropped in the last couple
What does
weeks.
that mean?
The record is a collaboration between
Oh.
Dave as composer and Stargaze as a performance ensemble and Dirty Projectors as performers. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how Dave Longstreth would collaborate with Dirty Projectors, but there you go.
It was a complicated endeavor, let me tell you. In any case, before we get into all that, we thought we'd talk about the recent Bernie Sanders rally in Los Angeles, which Michael unfortunately was not able to attend, having relocated recently to Brooklyn.
I just missed it. My the people I was staying with went.
Oh,
to the
really?
rally. Yes.
And they have good things to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're kind of like I think it was more on the Bernie side than the like Walls Harris or Harris Walls side. Democratic Party probably, but like was active in both. And the Dirty Projectors, you said, or was it just Dave played?
It was Dave primarily solo, but he was joined by two vocalists who I'm unaware of for a version of Rise Above to close out his portion
Okay.
of the set.
Yeah, it had a bit of like a 2020 update feel, right? Like the same sort of like
Yeah.
brand where they bring out indie musicians. You know, Maggie Rogers was there, and then
Yep.
obviously like, Joan Baez was there too.
Joan Baez and Neil Young. They were the final.
Which is kind of what was happening when Bernie was running, right? Like I think Vampire Weekend did.
And then there was also the Strokes, I think, did an event or opened a concert for him at some point. So, yeah, it does feel like a throwback to that energy, albeit with no presidential campaign attached this time, more just a kind of general anti-oligarchy, anti-Trump message. I watched Bernie's speech. I thought it was good for the most part. Didn't have anything truly objectionable. It is kind of interesting. He's still caught in a little bit of a weird position vis-a-vis the war in Gaza, right? Because he kind of has to say, like, Israel has a right to defend itself. However, it's gone too far, which
Not
is
like
which is I think probably not what some of his supporters would like to be hearing. But these are the realities of politics in America at this moment, obviously. So it's kind of understandable. But the rest of the stuff he was talking about was classic anti-inequality, pro Medicare for all. Pro a lot of very pro-union message throughout, which I thought was.
I mean,
was
a couple of takeaways, right? There's the clear choice of pairing with AOC, and obviously AOC did some stuff with Bernie during the 2020 campaign, but then sort of over the last 4 years seemed to tack center to try to mobilize whatever greater political ambition she had. And interestingly, I feel like that backfired in a way where the center wasn't holding it all, and now she is sort of heading maybe back into this vein. Does that make sense?
I think that's right. I mean, it didn't hold in a couple ways. On the one hand, both she and Bernie very strongly backed Biden even after the debate fiasco, which seemed just kind of like, what are we doing here, people? What's going on? And then, of course, Biden was replaced anyway. And then, once the new congressional term began, she ran to be the Democratic head of one of the committees. I mean, the Republicans control Congress, so she wouldn't be the actual head, but she'd be the ranking member, and was rebuffed, and they put in a geriatric person who was literally dying of cancer instead of her. So it sort of seems like if she was hoping to kind of, and I think Pelosi really spearheaded the move to scuttle her,
Oh, okay.
So it seemed like whatever she was trying to get out of attacking center certainly didn't work to endear her to the sort of Pelosi faction of Congress.
Mhm.
And, quite frankly, it's just as well. The other downside, of course, is that, now she seems kind of like a little bit of an opportunist or a fraud in the eyes of some leftists because of this effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true, but also I'm not really sure how much impact that is going to have. I mean, if her greater ambitions is to run, can she run in? Is she old enough to run in 28? Is that right?
She is. I don't necessarily think she's going to, but she will
I
be old
don't
enough.
either, but I don't like. I guess at some point people will just have to come to grips with the reality that there's not a single, even remotely recognizable name beyond her in any
On the left, at least.
on whatever. let's let's call it from the center to the left,
Are you
right?
disparaging Mayor Pete, Michael? How
Well,
dare
but I
you?
guess what I mean is that like I consider him to be more on the neoliberal right of an actual politics,
Oh, I mean, okay,
and
yes, I think that's correct.
right. But
But
then, but I also think that um, you know I was reading this New Republic piece on the event, which was titled "Bernie and AOC are starting a new political movement before our eyes." I wonder if that's how you sort of felt about it. But one of the things that they went through pains to let people know is that it didn't seem like I believe the quote was this wasn't a hardened Bernie 2016 rally. Uh, the writer who is Alex Thomas said is they saw more Harrison Walls shirts than Bernie 2020 shirts, which may just be because it's you'd be wearing a shirt that was like 6 years old. I don't know. But
yeah, I think it's also that this is something I've heard reported by Dave Weigel and other people about this tour of rallies that they've been on for the last couple months.
mhm,
Is that the turnout is much more broad based than just hardcore Bernie supporters. There was a hilarious Iglesias tweet where he was like, well, Bernie has a big mailing list and is very popular among his diehard supporters, so of course the turnout has been good.
right.
And then Weigel's like, yeah, but like 70% of the people are not Bernie people at the right. I mean, there's like
Yeah.
what Iglesias was saying was basically wrong. Like, and I think it's just because they're the only Democrats or people on the left doing anything publicly to sort of confront and oppose the Trump administration when we saw what happened with Chuck Schumer when he attempted to, well, he basically refused to even entertain a filibuster or any, sort of
Yeah.
strategic deployment of his powers in the Senate to slow the adoption of the
I was
continuing
gonna
resolution.
sort of building on that. I was gonna say the second thing that I noticed was that there was this notion in the piece that one of the things that sort of caught the writer's eye was that the crowd seemed to react more to oligarchy, big corporate, big billionaire messaging than scorn to Trump. And I think that it's kind of an important distinction to make because I do think that that actually helps ultimately the likes of Sanders and then to some extent AOC because I think going back to this idea of like the hardened 2016 crowd, I just think that while the writer is trying to say that it's a new message as well, it didn't from what I saw with Bernie, it didn't feel like that particularly like a new message.
No,
But
I agree.
in terms of a new movement, I mean, I do think that there just probably weren't close to enough people ready to listen to this type of thing after 8 years of Obama.
Hmm.
Then, like the focus was on Trump so acutely in 2020, and now the sort of attention is diffused away from Trump in the first time because there's like Trump, there's his minions who are doing such heinous things are more visible, and then on top of that, like the Musk of it all, which draws this line that Bernie's been making forever, just so plainly that if there are more, people in the Harris Walls side of the party who are there, it sort of makes sense that it's just, I don't think Bernie thought he'd have to wait till 2025, but that just there's just it's overwhelming to people at this point to continue rejecting the fact that he was at least on to something when he first started considering running for president. It's just impossible. And I think in a way, there's an opening for a more left leaning side of the Democratic Party simply because of like fear, despair, and a degree of fatigue of like
and anger.
all the energy to reject Sanders's argument in the face of just overwhelming like obviousness.
Yeah, and I think pointedly, Harris refused to run an anti-billionaire campaign, right?
That's
I
right.
mean, there were indications that this would be the most effective line of attack against Trump and his coalition,
Mhm.
especially when Musk was, already on board, obviously, during the election.
Yeah.
And her advisors advised against this. What a shock. Where were they getting their money from? Ah, billionaire donors. Strange. And yeah, so it's not a surprise given what's happened that this obvious, you know, that this is the enemy that we have to be targeting, that these are the people who are really billionaires, I mean, who are spearheading this movement to strip us of rights and of economic power, of bargaining power, of freedom of speech,
Right.
And so, I think it's good. I'm not exactly over brimming with hope,
No,
but
but I mean, I think that the ability to like run as a presidential candidate for AOC is not ultimately going to have really been hinged on positively or negatively on her sort of tack to the center that's been going on. I don't think it will really matter at this point in politics, and it's quite clear that in lieu of something completely unforeseen, that Sanders is trying to influence AOC and like set her up
yeah, pass
so
the
that
baton, so to speak.
right. So while it might be too early to think of it, but it just seems to me that there's an inevitability that if they are going to go around for 2 years, let's say, talking about the urgency of now,
Hmm.
hard to imagine that she is not one of the candidates for president in 2028. That's my bet.
Yeah, and we'll be here to track it.
Or Sanders.
That would be wild.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this the other
I did
day.
hear last thing before we talk. I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
did hear this. Unfortunately, on my algorithm, I will get from time to time like a Bill Maher clip, and he was recently interviewing none other than Steve Bannon,
Oh yeah.
um, and they were talking about uh, how Trump's going to be president in January 2029, right?
Hmm.
And the idea of like running again for a third term, blah blah blah. And Bill Maher brought up the point that like that would imply that Barack Obama could run for president should the norm, shall we call it, give way.
Yeah. Well, we can only hope that that's what comes to pass. I God knows what a great pair of options that would give us.
Yeah.
I was thinking just one last thing about Bernie. I was thinking about like throughout history, when of very old people played like a critical role, and the only person I could really think of was like Narses the eunuch, who was one of Justinian's generals, who when he was reconquering Italy in the 530s or 40s, he was like 90 years old.
Really?
This eunuch general, he just comes into Italy and just mops up. He just despite the fact that he's like presumably, barely able to walk with a cane, is just
Right.
commanding legions and they're yeah. But the track record of the extremely old, successful leader is
Hmm.
it's pretty slim pickings out there. Um, all right, so we should talk about these records. This is the first episode we've ever done on music, which
Yeah.
is a format breaking episode. But I thought this is a good topic, just because these two artists who I've really liked for a long time and been sort of peripherally involved with in various ways, have seen both in concert countless times and have other connections that will inevitably come up a little later. But the first record to talk about would be this Mount Eerie album, Night Palace, which came out in towards the end of last year. And Mount Eerie is a band that I first became aware of when it was still called the Microphones in the early 2000s, probably around the time he started. He rebranded the project as Mount Eerie around 2003. Mount Eerie is the name of a mountain on uh, Fidalgo Island, which is where the town of Anacortes is, which is where Phil Elverum, the mastermind of the project, grew up, and he sort of came to
Is it
prominence.
just him or is there a band?
It's mostly just him.
Okay.
Occasionally when I went to see Mount Eerie play in November, at in Greenpoint at one of the Polish nightclubs. I forget which one, Warsaw, I believe it's
Mhm.
called, and it was great. But there were some musicians playing with him, but it's not a band in the sense of there are five people who are Mount Eerie who've been on tour for 20
Okay.
years. The only consistent member is Phil himself. He writes all the music, he records all of it himself. On the records, often he is the one playing all the instruments.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, even though there are two different names, there's the microphones in Mount Eerie, it's a pretty consistent through line. It doesn't, the name change did not denote like a change in focus in the project.
Sure.
He first came to prominence, I would say, in the kind of Pitchfork, early days of Pitchfork indie sphere with an album from 2001, fortuitously released on September 11th, 2001, called The Glow Part 2. It's one of those things. I think the Strokes, one of their big records came out on that day too.
Uh-huh.
It was a Tuesday. Tuesday used to be New Music Day.
Sure.
The Glow Part 2 is great. It's, again, mostly Phil. It has a lot of what we could call classically romantic themes, romantic with a capital R. A lot of it's a rumination on childhood, on the relationship of the body to the natural world. And it's recorded on tape. All analog recording techniques are used. And it's recorded in this perfectly imperfect way that's kind of hard to put your finger on, where there are mistakes that are left in, but once you listen to the record enough times, they don't even feel like mistakes. They feel just sort of like the organic happenstance of the way a river flows imperfectly and
Uh-huh.
rises. In a weird way, the recording technique that he employs mirrors the themes that he is engaging with. On one of the songs, he says, "My roots are strong and deep." And he's kind of analogizing himself to like a tree rooted in the Solofidago Island, where he grew up in Seattle. And this is a theme that he revisits on Night Palace. And it's a great album. Pitchfork, I think, named it the album of the year for 2001. And he's one of these interesting
The
people.
least they could do.
What's that?
Least they could do.
Yeah, they were
With it being released on 9/11. I
yeah, it
mean,
overcame that hurdle,
throw him
right?
a bone.
Yeah. It would be funny if he had the Nick Castellanos thing of like his records somehow only came out on days of great national import or
Right,
horror.
right.
But no, no. He kept releasing records in a similar vein. There's another record called Mount Eerie, came out a couple years later, that is a sort of it's sort of concept album. It's very mythological. Mythology is very important in his work. You have this sense of like these ancient forces from these hills and islands of northern Washington kind
Mhm.
of being evoked almost as primordial spirits. And I think I forget the first time I saw him, but maybe 2005, 2004. I went to see him in the woods outside Palmer, Massachusetts. This is the thing. He released this album. Pitchfork was like, "Oh, this is the best album of the year." A lot of artists on getting that kind of hype would look to upgrade. All right, enough with this home recording. I'm going to move into a bigger studio. I'm going to get a real band. I'm going to tour. I'm going to get bigger and bigger. I'm going to play stadium. It
Yeah.
might stoke some kind of ambition or grandeur. But I think Phil in his music sort of reserves the grandeur for the ideas and the concepts that he explores, and
Very cool.
I mean, after this record came out, I remember he went on tour of like coffee shops in Idaho with like three friends, and we'd be playing in house shows. And a number of times I've seen him play in tiny venues. I saw him play in a field, as I said. I saw him play, in like an old warehouse with like 50 people. This kind of thing.
Right.
So I think there's something very respectable about that. Also, the fact that he changed the project's name. You've got this great successful album under this band, the Microphones. He's like, well, let's leave all that behind, which I think is interesting.
Which was pretty shortly after, right? He changed the name in
Yeah,
20.
2003, I think. So yeah, it he's brought back the name a few times. Like he did a record in 2007 or 8 called "Don't Smoke," and it was the microphones "Don't Smoke," and it was just a song about how smoking was bad. And I think the B side was something like "Get Off the Internet." It was this very weird, like direct didactic phase that he went through. And
Yeah.
then in 2020, he did a record called "The Microphones in 2020" that is just one continuous 40 plus minute track where he kind of talks about his life in and around and before and just after the time he was writing and recording the Glow Part 2. And it's fantastic. It's it's just a 40-minute like masterpiece. And it was limited. You can't listen to it on streaming services. I think there's a video on YouTube you can listen to. But again, he does these things that are like that they seem to be like deliberately he's trying to keep a level of mystery alive in his music. The other big phase is he was married to this wonderful cartoonist called Geneviève Castré, and they had a child around 2016, and shortly thereafter she was diagnosed with terminal cancer and passed away, I think, about a year after their child was born, something like that. My dates, obviously, just horrible thing. And I saw Geneviève play with Phil several times, and I've looked at her art. Her art is amazing. And this led to him recording this record called "A Crow Looked at Me" in 2007, which, in contrast,
17.
what's that? 17, sorry. Which, in contrast to the Glow Part 2 and the earlier stuff, is a lot sparer, and it's very raw and emotionally direct. Sort of songs about going back into the room where your partner was recently alive and now they're gone, and trying to reckon with being in that same space. This record was very successful despite being incredibly dark, and I went to see Phil perform this maybe 2018 at the Knockdown Center, that factory
Yeah.
in Bushwick or wherever that is. And it was very interesting because it was packed, and it was like everyone was sitting on those white folding chairs, and it was just him on a stage singing these songs that are just
Hmm.
like very beautiful but very bleak and dark.
Yeah.
In any case, Night Palace is the new record, and this is the one that's attributed to Mount Eerie once again. And it's
So this is the one that you are loosely defining as the climate rock, right?
yeah, this is
So
the
he
one.
he obviously speaks about themes of nature throughout all of his work, right?
That's right.
What is there a distinction? Is there something more to the point about the degradation of the world? Like how are you finding that distinction?
I feel like in this record there is a sort of modulation. There are a bunch of short plaintive songs that are kind of
Mhm.
about vicissitudes of living with his daughter, um, living where he lives, kind of day to day
Is he
life.
still out there?
Yeah, he lives more remotely. Apparently he moved to a even more remote island in
Awesome.
Washington State. Yeah, and
That has been overrun.
well, some of the songs are about how even in this place, there's like tourists that have summer
Yeah,
homes, that they leave the
right.
lights
Yeah.
on, and then it's just like the energy suck. Yeah, there's a lot of songs that are um, kind of directly, they're more experimental. They're kind of noise. They're noise oriented,
Mhm.
and they seem to be reckoning with like cataclysmic forces of nature that have been and are about to be unleashed. There's a song called "Huge Fire" that's about how he has to gather all the tinder and sticks that accumulate around his house and just burn them up, because if you don't do that, that's like
There could
leaving
be a
you
fire.
vulnerable to wildfires and things like this. So the climate theme feels much more, if not overt, it's certainly a presence throughout the record.
For sure.
And particularly, he seems to have been like much more aware of colonialism in this record.
Mhm.
He's talking a lot about how there's one song where he talks about how the name for the island he lives on has another name, and it's the name of the indigenous inhabitants who, for the most part, have been forced from the land. And he kind of questions. I mentioned the roots are strong and deep. On another song, he mentions that he isn't actually as deeply rooted to this land. He was when he sang that earlier when he was younger. He was perhaps ignoring the realities of how his ancestors and the sort of American imperial project itself came to occupy this space.
Interesting. So like even though he's living in this comparatively simple and remote fashion, that doesn't like absolve not necessarily him, but absolve the process itself from having taken place.
That's exactly right. I think it's, and I think also
Because you
just,
get the impression from listening to the new album that he's like almost like a steward of his surroundings. He seems to take great care, right? It doesn't feel, how would I say it? I listening to the album, I would say it doesn't feel like he's not living this life. And that's something that's I think oftentimes, especially when it comes to music about something like this, you wonder whether it's being done to do it or to say it. But with this album, it felt like, if I had to imagine what his actual day to day is like, um, it feels like it's very much in touch with the music.
yeah, absolutely. And I've seen documentary. There was a documentary made a couple years ago about, where a guy just went and like kind of followed him around for a day. And yeah,
What's he like?
what's that?
What's he like?
Well, I've met him a few times. I'm never really hung out with him, mostly just in the brief after show.
But in the documentary, like, is he kind? He seemed like a kind.
Yeah, I think he's pretty normal, you know?
Yeah.
Like obviously he has a sort of poetical imagination. He surrounds himself with poetry. There's a lot of poetry in his house. There are other documentaries I've seen. Um, but he's raising a kid. His I think his daughter is probably about 10 now,
Okay.
and he's on his own. It's probably part of the reason that he's turned to thinking about the bigger climate themes on some level is
Right.
realizing you've brought a new person into the world. And he has this beautiful song about her growing under the canopy of his life,
Hmm.
which is really touching and lovely. But there's also implicit in that the realization that he's not going to live forever. I mean, his
Hmm.
partner has already passed on. Like it's eventually the next generation is going to be left with what we've left them, right?
Yeah.
And I think he does a good job on this record of kind of connecting the colonialist impulse with this sort of despoiling of the environment, right? That seeing that in a kind of intersectional way, where it's
Hmm.
like the reason the indigenous people needed to be forced off is so that we could like take what was on their land, right? Whether it be oil or timber or building condos or however you manifest this. Like these two, the act of colonialization of colonialism, the philosophy of it is inextricable from environmental despoilation, right? He also has just this is some quite poetical lines in the record. One thing he says that I thought was great is like recorded music is a statue of a waterfall, which has that kind of Heraclitus, you never step into the same river twice kind of energy, right?
Yeah.
Like a statue of a waterfall is paradoxical. Keats's Grecian urn, right? The two lovers are about to kiss, but they'll never reach each other because they're on a statue, right? But then music has movement in a way that static art doesn't. Anyway, I'd say in this record, he's kind of doing the thing he's always done, which is attempting to expand his horizons, remake his horizons, to borrow parlance from our second artist. But it reminds me of Emerson, right? One of the things Ralph Waldo Emerson, is obsessed with is this idea of the horizon, that our perspective is always bounded by this limit.
Right.
And in order to achieve sort of new breakthroughs in thinking, we've got to find ways of surpassing that limit, either by relocating ourselves or by changing the way we see or changing the way we look in some kind of way. And I feel like there's also kind of an awareness of what we might call geologic deep time. Um, Deep time was a movement in literary study in the 90s, I guess it started, where it was starting to recognize that, human life is very brief, right? And that the way, massive environmental shifts historically have occurred is better seen from the kind of like zoomed out perspective of this the idea of geology, right? Like thinking of a glacier moving across, the way that a glacier totally remakes an environment, but that happens over tens of thousands, if not millions of years, right?
Yeah.
And that I get the energy from Night Palace that Phil is trying to like find that kind of perspective both on his own life and as an individual, but also as a human being, as a representative of this larger group. Um,
he's also not without a sense of humor,
yeah,
right? Like
it's quite
it's
funny.
it's this fascinating ability to like sort of deal with sort of heavy things, but bring a degree of levity from time to time that I think really helps escape sort of the drudge of the subject a lot of
The
times.
ponderousness, yeah,
My favorite line in the part of the whole album is it's like I spoke to a fish, right? It's a song.
yeah, great song.
It says, I know, it's a really great song. There's this great line. I told the fish, what you see as a palace is running water. The fish said, no. What you see as those mountains is flowing matter. I said, okay.
Yeah, and I mean that's the line I was thinking of with the geologic deep time, right?
Yeah,
It's like the fish is offering up this perspective of the mountains as not static, but as
that's
actually a
right.
part of this entropic change and flow, just in the same way that he, in his limited human perspective, sees the river in that way,
Mhm.
right? There's a line where he says the Cyclops walks across the sky. One thing he's always had this knack for is in an almost Wordsworthian way, kind of blending mythology and autobiography, sort of
Mhm.
seeing his own life in terms of like ancient myths while simultaneously recognizing his smallness within the grandeur of both nature and time,
Yeah.
right? And kind of modulating between those perspectives. It's like I am important, I'm a myth, but I'm also nothing, right?
Mhm.
Which I think the I spoke with a fish song also really gets at. And I sort of think this is one of the ways he's trying to tackle this paradox that we've talked about again and again with regard to climate change, right? Which is that it's such an enormous problem. None of us as individuals can make any particular changes in our own lives or the way we live in such a way as to have a meaningful impact. Yet at the same time, we can't just sit about and do nothing, right? Like I mean, there's this. So I think this sort of mythological, the grand to small, the tragic to humorous, these kind of oscillations are his attempt at creating a kind of vehicle that might lend the people that listen to the music some perspective on these things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, my takeaway from the album is that actually, I mean, I think that works. I
Yeah,
mean, I really do think that that blend is, again, I don't think that he would or he meant to like say that this is an explicitly political album meant to galvanize or anything
sure.
like that, but rather that like, you know, if doom scrolling and being aware supposedly of all of these nightmare situations that are unfolding and appear to only be able to get worse is not leading to any change in perspective or any hope, then like what about some reflection,
Yep.
right? That involves something far, like you said, grander than the sort of shallowness of the individual confronted it with an impossible task. And I mean, I've like that's how I came away from the album is like it actually just like from just a sheer emotional point of view, I thought it actually was quite uplifting in
Yeah.
that it feels like first that you are genuinely listening to a great artist and an interesting sort of music that someone like myself probably isn't exposed to all that often, but also that like it you really can relate. I mean, I can only imagine if you're I have a lot of friends who are young fathers, young mothers. I'm not, um, but
Same.
this would sort of really hit home about, because these are the types of things that he talks about sometimes on the record. It's what my friends are talking about. It's the kind of thing that they're wrestling with as well. And I don't know. I didn't know what to expect, but I would say to anybody who hasn't listened to him, I mean, I was really quite blown away. He's a really, really fantastic, fantastic guy.
Yeah, and I'll put links in the show notes to a bunch of places where you can buy the albums, stream the albums.
Interestingly, both albums have like 25 tracks, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Dirty Projectors slash
Hmm.
David Longstreth slash Stargaze.
Hmm.
This record is called Song of the Earth, and it is the latest offering from a longtime, sort of similar trajectory to Phil. I think Phil's slightly older than Dave, and
And Dave's had more mainstream e success, right?
I guess it's kind of hard to quantify. But Dave went to Yale with me. I was friends with him for a long time. Sort of drifted apart in more recent years, but I still find the art interesting and worth talking about. I think I first probably met him in, I think he was a year behind me because he took a year off before coming to college. And I first met him when we were both playing a concert at this place called the Yale Women's Center, where they would host rock shows from time to time.
Hmm.
And even then, I remember there just being something weird and good about his music. It was, I think I was playing it.
What was it like? Because this was before, obviously, Dirty Projectors, right?
Well, Dirty Projectors, I think, was starting around this time.
Okay.
He was
But they hadn't
playing.
released it, right?
His first record came out in 2003, I think.
Okay.
But
So it was before.
yeah, this is just before the first the Glad Fact came out. He was playing with a nylon string guitar. Uh, Wrote interesting kind of singer songwritery things. Sang
Mhm.
in a way that was unafraid of error in a way
Yeah.
that's positive. Not like he was a bad
That's a
singer,
good.
but he was kind of reaching for things that maybe uh, he wasn't quite hitting in a sort of pitch perfect way, but it was still hitting in a way that was very effective. Um, and I think that's true of Phil as well. Like, it, it, there's something about like a certain kind of perfectionism that's antithetical to the ethos of this kind of early 2000s indie rock. I mean, think of a band like Neutral Milk Hotel, which I think
Mhm.
is somewhere in the background for both these artists in some ways. Uh, really strong songwriting, really strong singing, but singing that's kind of a little bit abrasive.
Yeah.
Um, in any case, I got to be closer friends with Dave a few years later when he was working on some more ambitious kind of music that combined his kind of singer songwriter impulse with his study at Yale, which was he was a music major. He studied classical composition, and so he had this group that he called it was the Orchestral Society for the Preservation of the Orchestra. That he wrote this piece and recorded in one of the Yale chapels, and it was this record called Slaves' Graves, and then Slaves' Graves was an EP, and then it was later combined with another record, Slaves' Graves and Ballads. And I remember hearing it for the first time shortly after it came out, and just being kind of like blown away. I was like, wait a minute, one of my classmates here did this? Like this, you're allowed to do this? This is
Right.
possible? I was just kind of, in my own musical journey at that point, I'd been kind of stuck in this sort of jazz paradigm for a while and
Mhm.
had been alienated from my true rock nature. And I would definitely credit meeting Dave with being one of the things that kind of shocked me out of that and brought me
Right.
back to learn of artists like him, like the Microphones, Little Wings, Joanna Newsom, and yeah, there was a kind of symphonic. There's the thing with Dirty Projectors. It's always kind of been balancing between these two tendencies. This sort of symphonic, late 19th century kind of romantic modernist
Yeah.
uh, symphonic tension with more conventional indie rock singer songwriter like Elliott Smith, what have you.
Mhm.
And different impulses have kind of won out more dramatically at different points. The record he was making when we first became better friends was called the Getty Address. And like with Slaves Graves, it's more Slaves Graves and Ballads was like the Slaves Graves thing was this like orchestral thing, and then Ballads were just him with a guitar. And then Getty Address kind of brought these two together and sort of using the uh, digital technology kind of did a lot of cuts and editing and sampling and playing with panning and looping orchestral parts in the background as he's singing over them, and as a strange percussion part is like it's the Getty Address is like a great record. Like it's
Mhm.
really weird. I listened to it for the first time in a couple of years last night, and I was just like, yeah, still good. um, but it's a little bit challenging. I think Phil's music, just to draw a comparison, uh, is a little bit more welcoming in some ways. It's a little bit
Sure.
more accessible. And Phil's music can be very abrasive at times too, but it's abrasive in more of like a thrash. It gets into this like thrash energy at times, which
Mhm.
is awesome. Whereas there's like a glitchiness to this record. I believe the Getty Address was described as a glitch opera, where it's kind of cutting. And also, I think Dave's always been influenced by contemporary pop music. Like Justin Timberlake, I think, was a big influence. And, trying to do Justin Timberlake uh, on a laptop in New Haven, Connecticut, it's gonna sound different. But listening to it again, I was like, oh yeah, like that's the Justin Timberlake influence. I remember this now. It all kind of came back to me. Um, Also, I would say throughout Dave's music, there's less of the kind of personal mythology as you get with microphones and Mount Eerie, but there's always this like political subtext to everything. So like in Slaves' Graves, one of the refrains is like, these are the feelings of slaves all spiraling upwards, interior monocots whose rage expressed in slogans. And monocot is like a type of plant. So it's almost like the feelings of slaves are like these plants that are like growing up through cracks in the pavement to kind of
Mhm.
remind us of our tragic history, right? He's also obsessed with slogans. Getty Address is also very into um, this creating a kind of myth, but in this case, it's about like the Getty Company and like oil drilling for oil, but it's also about Clear Channel, the
Oh,
radio. Remember the radio monopoly?
yes.
Clear Channel rebranded as iHeartRadio, by the way. Brilliant, brilliant rebrand, guys. Nice work. Um, and remember, in the post 9/11 moment, Clear Channel was like, these are the songs you absolutely cannot play, right? And it was like any song about fire, any song, right? And it was this weird kind of corporate censorship. I remember that was something that was Dave was quite exercised about at the time, and rightfully so. Also, the
I
here,
was in Canada just at the time, so we just held the course with the Tragically Hip and Rush.
yeah, yeah, you just
Nothing to
like
see here.
just Joni Mitchell on every channel at
Yeah, that's right.
just whatever we can do to get that canned content out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the main character of the story is oddly Don Henley in the Getty Address, and he's like
Mhm.
guided on this tour of America by Sacagawea. So you can see some of the same kind of mythological impulses we discussed with Mount Eerie. Uh, After that, there was a kind of a pivot. These first few records, Glad Fact, Slaves, Graves, and Ballads, and Getty Address, are mostly solo records, but with a lot of other musicians helping out. But it's not really like a band.
Mhm.
So once he finished college, he kind of got the first touring version of a full band together, and this gradually, emerged in the around 2006, 2007 as the band that would kind of rise up to prominence in the indie rock scene of Brooklyn, being kind of one of the standard bearers for this sort of late 2000s indie rock peak, if you will. Would that have been was that before you moved to New York, or you moved?
No, it was right when I came down in '09.
Yeah, so it was like right then. That
It all happened
that was the moment. Yeah,
at the top of
exactly.
our lives. So.
Uh, you're like, that's why I came. I heard
Yeah.
an Animal Collective on the radio, and I just packed my bags. Um, Rise Above kind of continues the political themes. It's a reimagining of Black Flags Damaged. And then Bit of Orca is a great record, obviously. And that was followed in 2012 by Swing Low Magellan. This was kind of the period when Dave was working with Nat Baldwin, Brian McComber, Amber Kaufman, Angel
I
Deradorian.
actually always loves Swing Low Magellan. I think it was my favorite of their albums. I mean, maybe just because it feels more accessible than a lot of his other work.
Yeah, and I think I was surprised to see that Swing Low Magellan, the song, is like by far his most popular track on Spotify. It's
Yeah.
which
I
is
mean,
like a nice
is it in a commercial?
could be, I don't know.
I mean, it feels like it's born to be in an Apple commercial.
It's a great song.
It's a great song.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really beautiful. I remember even as all this was happening, and I would see Dirty Projectors, I don't know, 10 times a year around this time.
Mm.
I would go to all their concerts. And I always remember the best ones being the ones where and it was just kind of Dave by himself playing his guitar and just sort of sitting in a room singing. I was always like, yeah, like this is good. What's that?
Interesting.
I
I
mean,
think I have the opposite experience. I didn't see them nearly as much as you, but um, I liked
the
the whole
band.
shebang.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
mean the band was great. I'm not saying that to slight anyone, but I just remember a couple. I remember this show in Providence in like
I don't know. I
2000.
always felt like when he did it by himself, that it just a lot of it just felt like stuff was missing that needed to be
That may
there.
be true. I think maybe I'm also thinking of shows before the band was
Yeah.
like fully realized.
Hmm.
I don't know. It doesn't matter. So Dave and Amber were a couple for a while, and they split up. I think sometime around 2013, 14, and after that, that older version of the band kind of uh, moved on, and new people were brought in, and I sort of kind of stopped following them as closely at this point, and
We both bud.
yeah, and there were a couple more records that came out. They also did a record with Bjork in 2011, Mountain Wittenberg
Right.
Orca, which is a great record. Has some really beautiful stuff on it. Um,
So they managed to swing a great album with Bjork, huh? Who could have seen it coming?
yeah, yeah, it's a great record. No Embrace, I think, is my favorite song from that one. Um, the sort of symphonic stuff from the early records didn't ever completely disappear. It was always there in the background. There would be strings on a lot of their records. There was a string arrange, or there was like a concert rearrangement of the Getty Address that was performed at Lincoln
Mhm.
Center. I actually was for some reason I wasn't able to see that, but I I heard it was very good. So it's not like he went during this full band like Stillness is the Move, appearing on TV shows, playing at
Yeah.
large festivals, things like that. This symphonic thing was still there in the background, and Song of the Earth, which takes its name from a piece by Gustav Mahler, one of Mahler's late pieces, written just before he passed away. Mahler lived from 1860 to 1911. He's kind
But
of
made his real breakthrough in Tar, right?
Tar, yeah, yeah, probably best known from Tar, right?
That's
Uh,
not Blanche
yeah,
Tar.
Kate Blanchett as Tar is probably his greatest champion. Yeah, Mahler's kind of the transitional figure in many people's eyes from Romanticism to modernism, and I think that's kind of like a useful way if we were to compare Mount Eerie to Dirty Projectors, is that
Interesting.
if Mount Eerie is kind of like Romanticism writ large, reinvented for the 21st century, um, I feel like Longstreth's music is more like post. Um, it's like post romantic, edging into that modernist territory in the way that Mahler is, right?
Mhm.
Um, and what do I mean by that? Well, it's a little bit more jagged. There's like a use of looping and atonality in a way at times that feels reminiscent of that. Despite taking its title from the Mahler piece, I didn't find the record to be that overtly similar to Mahler's music. I hadn't listened to Mahler in forever, but I put that on the other day, and I was like, all right, the Mahler piece is like a symphonic tone poem where it's, you know, a symphony like piece, but there are also singers singing lyrics that I believe are derived from Chinese poetry in German, of course. This is a record that I think some critics have had trouble with because even though it's labeled as being a Dirty Projectors record, it's definitely more of a like symphonic, like classical music.
Right.
It's a piece of classical music rather than being something like Bitte Orca or any of the.
Right. It's really nothing like it. I mean, it's
Well, I think there's slight similarities, but
it
yeah,
just. I mean, it feels like a Dave Longstreth project more than a band album for sure.
yeah,
Right.
which I think it is. I mean, I think it was commissioned originally by this group Stargaze in Berlin, and the labeling of it as Dirty Projectors is partly because several of the current members of Dirty Projectors perform on the record.
Yes. Right.
Also, partly, I think, for just recognition purposes, right? Like,
Well, they got reviewed. It got reviewed by Pitchfork,
yeah,
who I think probably would have reviewed it whether it said David Longstreth or or Dirty Projectors. But I did just want to read, uh, because it's a middling review, basically, right?
yeah, a little.
He's,
I don't think the reviewer really got the record.
but he did have a great line that I just wanted to
Hmm.
revisit here. Though the overall picture is blurry, the individual parts can sound good, with a few exceptions. Gimme Bread, which is a song I did not like or understand, is an early primer on the album's unique mess and excess. I think that's not wrong. As Longstreth croons under his range, there's a pet soundy part, then a harp freakout with people chanting, then a riffy part, all before the menacing Pharaoh Monk style horns burst in, taking the climactic insight about bread a little too seriously. I just found that such a funny review. Like, it really does sort of sum up the moments when I feel like both the band and Dave get a little too much for me.
Uh,
And then just the idea of taking the climatic insight about bread a little too seriously was sort of unnecessarily cutting, I think.
yeah, I thought the review was a little bit unfair. I didn't find the record to be as discontinuous as or like the record made sense to me as a whole. Maybe the first time I listened to it, I was like, all right, this is a little challenging, this is a little different than what I was expecting.
Mhm.
And then the second time through, I was like, oh, okay, like I get it. Like themes were coming back to me. Like as I was going to sleep last night, I was like thinking about certain themes and like musical themes. I was like, oh yeah, like that theme's kind of sticking with me a little now in a way that it wasn't after my initial couple listens. Um, that said, I can understand someone who comes to this looking for a Dirty Projectors record being like, what is this, right? Like,
Where's About to Die?
yeah. One of the more divisive pieces is this uninhabitable Earth, which paragraph
This
one.
is where it really lost me, I think.
Okay, like it takes
Where were
the
you? Why don't you explain what it is before we
so
talk?
it sets the opening paragraph of David Wallace Wells' 2019 book, or is it the essay from 2017? Unclear. I didn't check. But it sets it to music, and I think this is an example of what I mean by like modernism, or maybe even postmodernism when I'm talking about this sort of Dirty
Mhm.
Projectors project, which is that like this is a weird thing to do. It's like let's find a nonfiction text and like use that as like the libretto for this piece
And
of
the
music.
Pitchfork review does
Calls it out.
sum up what I think about it, which maybe not even maybe it's even kinder. It says in uninhabitable Earth, paragraph one, Longstreth sings an extract from a climate journalist book verbatim, which seems like a cool thing to try before instantly seeing why it doesn't work well at all. It doesn't really seem like that cool of a thing to try. That's my take on it.
Uh huh. I
And
don't
I
know.
think that sort of where I land with him and this album's like probably the most I've ever felt this about him, because I do love so many of his songs, and I think some of the albums are so great. There's a piece of what Dave does where it feels like the idea is more impressive than what I'm hearing. And that's how I felt by and large in this album. I don't feel like I didn't get it, and I think you're
Sure.
probably right. Poor guy seems a little confused at times, but it it's like I'm sitting down, maybe I shouldn't have also like read the New Yorker, like read about it, talked to you about it before I listened to it, but like it's like okay, I'm understanding what he's saying about this, but it just doesn't do it. Like it just, you know what I mean? Like there are moments, as with anything this guy will ever make, that are like, this is really cool and
Yeah.
it sounds really fascinating. But as an overall thing, which this what is meant to be, because this isn't an album with the band, just a bunch of songs, right? I mean, and a lot of his work is meant to be cohesive, but this is like explicitly,
Right.
you know, thing, and it's just like it just couldn't retain my sort of Philistine attention for.
Well, no need to be harsh on your
But that's
yourself.
like the sensation that I think a lot of people, myself included, who and I'm like I like and love a bunch of the music.
Sure.
I'm imagining that I wasn't in love with a lot of Dave's work, and then I listened to this. I would fall in the category of like, and I think a lot of people do, and I don't know if he sort of revels in that sometimes or doesn't care, which is probably fine.
Sure.
People are just like, what the hell is going on? There are people who will listen to it and think that about this, and whether that's I remember going to a Q&A
Uh-huh.
with him, talking after, I think it was, maybe it was some like a music video, or it was the Swing Low Magellan era, and you know he packs all of this politics and references and amazingly like layered composition, and he these sort of nerdy dudes gravitate
Sure.
towards Abe, of like, look at all the things he's doing and what he's talking about, and it's so open to interpretation and stuff. And like, I gotta say, like, this guy asked this question, and like, whatever. I mean, I would never ask such a thing, but basically, he like took a stab at interpreting. I think it was About to Die,
Uh-huh.
right? And he like just basically said, like, is this what the song is about? Like, I'm listening to it and I'm hearing this and whatever, the tablets or whatever, and you know whether this is just like what like rock stars do or whatever. Of course, he answered in this like totally disengaged way at his own Q&A, where he's just like, I mean, it's maybe like, I don't know, it's just the words in the song, like something to that effect. It's like, like, I don't mind if you do that if you're just doing like the simplest rock music I've ever heard,
Sure.
but like, spare me a little bit that you're gonna take such care with your craft, like a guy like Longstreth does, to his credit,
Yeah.
to his credit, and then pretend that you like can't meet this guy, this fan of yours, at a level and be like, this is what I was thinking when I did all of this shit to make this song. That's basically like where I'm at with it.
Yeah. But the interpretive fallacy is at play there, though, which is to say that your interpretation is every bit as valid as the creator of any work of art's
Oh,
interpretation.
100%. What I'm saying is,
Yeah.
if you're doing a Q&A, it's like
Sure. You may as well humor people a little bit.
literally
You
a
could at least be like, wow, that's cool, man. Like, I didn't think about it that way, but totally,
yeah,
that's
I just didn't
valid.
get like, I don't know. I mean, it's been many a year. Maybe he uttered something to that effect, but I do remember just being like, this feels like you could be a little kinder with like the nerd who's so obsessed with you that he's.
Yes. Well, um,
I don't think he's shying. He seems to be in the interviews and stuff. He's talking quite directly and literally about this work, right?
yeah. And I mean, the analogy to the recent fires in LA has come up quite a lot in the sort of promo material. That the day this album was announced, in fact, and it does have over climate change themes, as we've already touched on.
Mhm.
That was the day that the wildfires like broke out. And
Oh,
Dave,
wow.
he lives in LA. Like,
Kind of circling back to the Bill album being released on 9/11, right?
yeah, yeah, interesting.
The
So
climate.
yeah, I mean, I think the record is there's a couple really great moments. I really like Blue of Dreaming, beautiful song.
Mm.
More of a song than it feels like a song in the classical music tradition as opposed to like an element in a suite.
That's right.
A lot of the music, and Phil Elverum appears on the record. Uh,
Oh, really?
yeah, he's on one of the
Because they're
middle.
good friends, right?
Yeah, I mean they've known each other for 25 years. I mean,
Mhm.
um, I saw some photo that maybe Dave shared or someone of him appearing in like the year 2001 or something with Phil at a concert in an Anacortes. So yeah, I mean that's part of the reason I wanted to do these two records, like think about them together. And yeah, is this a record I'm going to like return to in the way that I returned to Beta Orca over and over again? Probably not. Um, but I still like that it sort of is a return to the classical, weird classical stuff that was happening before the kind of band took off. Um,
Interesting.
feels like healthy artistic gesture to kind of return to your roots. Speaking of roots, once again, right?
I also think like to come down on the other side of like sort of the critique I was saying
Sure,
here. It's like the thing that has always sort of stuck with me is that, you know, whether you are someone who looks at, what Dave produces, and it is often criticized by people who just don't like it as like pretentious rock music,
sure,
pretentious. And I just think that's just kind of ridiculous on the face of it. And I think that like uh, wherever you come down on an individual work or the idea of everything at large that he's doing, there is something quite redeeming and endearing about the massive swings that he takes. That is something that I'm just like, okay, like that, because there is this moment, right, when they're reaching the sort of, like you said, that they're peaking in this indie rock apex scene. Kind of go back to what you said about Phil. It's not quite the same,
yeah, no, totally.
where Phil sort of goes to a more remote place or changes his band. But there's a world where after, stillness is the move, he could go all in, right? On like, I'm just gonna level up, like you were
I'm
talking
just
about.
gonna be a hip
Uh,
hop producer full time and
I
make like
am,
tons
and
of
like,
records.
there's no doubt in my mind that he could just make whatever amazing sort of pop album he wanted to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the fact that he has moved in sort of the 15 years or whatever after that through into this direction, like I just find it, if not interest it, if I'm not particularly interested in this album,
sure.
I do think there's something very cool about going that way.
I do too, and I think Dave is a father now too. So turning to these themes again of the climate of the future, thinking about the
Hmm.
Earth in a more holistic way makes sense, right? And again, like I don't think this is like a didact. I mean, I guess one of the problems with the Wallace Wells thing is that there's a touch of the didactic in it. It's
Oh
like
man, it felt so, it felt
it's a little
it
labored.
just felt ridiculous to me. It's like even the things that are too much for me from like Dave Longstreth and even the Dirty Projectors stuff, that I'm just like, I can't get into this.
Sure.
Like never felt like that to me. That just felt like really just like kind of boring. And he's never been boring, I
Yeah.
think.
I feel like the none of this is true thing was a little like kind of cuts both ways because it's like it's undercutting the kind of myths that Wallace Wells is addressing. But like the way it works in the song as a refrain, it's like none of this is true, including this thing that we're talking about, right? Like it kind of like undercuts the point that he's trying to make on some level.
I listened to it like 3 times in a row to because I was just like the first time I heard it, I was like, oh my God. And then
Yeah,
second time I listened to it, I was like, well, and then the third time I listened to it, I was back to the first
you're
time. And I
back
was like,
to yeah, yeah.
I can't. I'm sorry. I wish I could.
No, no. I mean, it's not for everyone. And I think making records like this that touch on these themes is good, if only that it registers that artists are actually thinking about this stuff,
Yeah.
and that our whole society isn't ostrich-like, just burying our heads in the sand as the world burns. It's like, put on the new Kid Rock album or whatever, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, just like, all right. Well, I think that's good for our discussion of climate change and indie rock. Hopefully, enjoyable conversation. There will be links to all the records on their Bandcamp pages in the show notes, as I said. Next week, we're going in a radically different direction, though.
We're back in our wheelhouse.
I mean, this I feel like has a Balloon Boy like potential to be just like
that's what I'm
a
saying,
zero downloads episode.
But I have maybe not been this excited to do an episode since Balloon Boy.
And that is because we were talking about crossing over with John Edward. That's right. Long Island's own most beloved psychic, the man who could talk to the dead and bring their voices back to the living.
He was shut down by the mainstream media.
Canceled, you might say.
Canceled.
An early victim.
Really, early adopter of the
early victim of cancel culture. Canceled for daring to speak to the victims of 9/11. And it doesn't get much lower than that.
It is. I've been watching footage.
Oh, dude, me too.
Yeah, people who didn't get to see that.
I'm losing it when I watch.
I feel so bad.
Did I send you that? I found a trove of episodes. I'll send you a link.
Yeah, it's such a moment, man. It's such a moment crossing over.
It's very weird. And that'll be fun. In the meantime, if you like the show, please feel free to follow us on the podcatcher of your choice. You can rate and review on the same podcatcher. Follow us on Instagram at the end of the world WMS. And yeah, I can't wait for John Edward. This is going to be 10 downloads. I can't wait.
Yeah.
But until then, this has been the End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And we will talk to you real soon.